Welcome to the Gynarchy Podcast. This is your host, Dr. Kirti Patel. Here we place women's health and feminism front and center where they belong, engaging in conversations that range from the fundamental to the fearless. With insights from expert guests, we aim to break through the barriers of the patriarchy and envision a new world led by the Gynarchy. So let's get started and dive right in. Welcome to the Gynarchy Podcast. This is your host, Dr. Kirti Patel, and today we're talking about sexual harassment. My guest today is Dr. Arghavan Salles. Dr. Salles is a national leader in diversity, inclusion, and equity, having earned a PhD studying these topics at Stanford University. She is also a surgeon and has extensive lived experience as an Iranian woman working in a male-dominated environment. Dr. Salles completed her medical school and residency in general surgery at Stanford prior to completing a fellowship in minimally invasive surgery at Washington University in St. Louis. After staying on faculty in St. Louis for a few years, Dr. Salles moved back to Stanford to work with the medical school on issues related to diversity and inclusion. Her research focuses broadly on gender equity, implicit bias, diversity, inclusion, and physician well-being. Her R01 grant from the NIH, which was recently terminated, focuses on sexual harassment. She is a sought-after speaker and has given over 100 national and international invited talks related to gender equity and sexual harassment in medicine. Welcome, Argavan.
Thank you so
How are
much.
you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Please correct me if I'm saying your name wrong, okay?
Argavan.
Arghavan. Okay.
Mhm.
I was saying it a little wrong. So, I have to tell you, I'm a little bit starstruck. That's why I was a little nervous in the intro because, you are kind of med Twitter and med Sky famous. So thank you. Thank you for being on my little old podcast.
Of course.
So I would love to know what inspired you to get into this work. You start out as a surgeon, and now you're doing research in sexual harassment and diversity and inclusion. So tell me about that.
Yeah, I basically had to do something different from medicine for a couple of years as part of my surgery residency program, which is very common. Many surgery residency programs, especially at academic centers, have like 2 years where residents will go do it. Historically, it was to do research, but people now do all sorts of things like get an MPH or an MBA or whatever, but something different from surgery residency. And so I had, just like everyone else, I had that time that I was supposed to go do something else. And I had really been interested in education most of my career. I'd always tutored and TA'd when I was in college and in medical school, and had been frustrated in medical school about how, especially on the clerkship side, the ways we assess people, it's not really very rigorous, right? Anyone who's been through it knows it's kind of like the attendings you work with, write something down, their thoughts, their impressions from
Very subjective.
Very subjective. And it might have been from like a couple of hours in clinic with you, or it might have been after a few weeks of time with you. It was highly variable. And even what you see in a rotation or even through the course of a residency is really just whichever patients are showing up while you're there. So there are, entire disease processes you might never see that your colleagues might see just because they were on call on a day that you weren't on call, and so it just seemed to me there's got to be a better way to organize medical education than just haphazard, whatever shows up is what you learn about. And then the way you're evaluated is people who are tired and overworked writing some thoughts down, because they're going to be penalized if they don't do it because they have to evaluate people, right? And that's not to ignore, by the way, the contributions of all these residency programs and medical schools obviously have lectures even during clerkships that are intended to have a little bit more of a structure. And those are great. But again, I don't think those quite fill the gaps. So that was my original intention. I went to the School of Education to get a PhD studying curriculum design and assessment. That's what I had intended to do. And I took a class, my first quarter, I believe it was, with a business school professor who talked about a lot of things related to diversity. And to be honest, I didn't intend to sign up for a class that was talking about diversity. It was called Leadership in Diverse Organizations. And I thought I was silly. So I thought it was different types of organizations because I was looking for something
diverse organizations.
Yes, exactly.
I could see that.
Because there wasn't that much like in the School of Education around healthcare. And obviously that was my background and that's what I was going to be going back to. Anyway, it was a serendipitous mistake because it was such a fantastic class. And I learned a lot that I didn't know because I'd never studied any sort of humanities or social science. I did engineering as an undergrad. And in that class, I learned about, so it was, very sciencey.
Really interesting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And in that class, I learned about something called stereotype threat, which is this idea that when aspects of our identity are made relevant in a performance domain, that can affect our performance. And so what that means is if, say, a woman is taking a math test and is asked her gender before the math test, she may perform worse just because she's reminded, even subconsciously, of the stereotype that women aren't good at math.
Wow.
Right.
That's really interesting. Stereotype threat. Okay. What a great new term for me.
Yeah. So, I mean, it may be a little bit controversial now. There's some people now who are questioning it, and we don't want to spend our time on that. But what I will say is, like, at that time, and even, I mean, the data on stereotype threat had been coming out since the 80s. And somehow, hadn't really penetrated medical education much. There are some physicians who know, and especially now there's more, but this was, 2008. And so there weren't many people in medicine talking about any of this. But I was really fascinated because I had grown up, we might be similar ages, I don't know, but when I was growing up, there was a heavy emphasis on meritocracy, right? And like SAT scores reflect your intelligence.
Same.
And right. So I believed it because that's what they told us. Like if you get a higher score, you're smarter. If you get a lower score, you're not as smart. And people deserve scholarships if they're smart. And, like all the things that go with meritocracy. And then when I learned that your SAT score could be worse just because someone asked you your race or your ethnicity before you took the test, all of a sudden I was like, well, what is the meaning of these numbers anyway? And then we're making these high stakes decisions about which college people can go to, which medical school people can go to, based on scores that can be influenced by something so seemingly minor as asking a demographic question before the test. Really made me question, like, what are we really doing here? And how are we assessing people? And I started really thinking about the biases that are inherent in these systems and in the idea of meritocracy itself. So that ended up changing my entire focus for my PhD. Ultimately, it wasn't just that one thing. I mean, I took some great sociology classes with a woman named Cecilia Ridgway. She's fantastic. That really helped me understand a lot of the things I had observed as a woman in surgery residency that I didn't have labels for because I had no background in this area. Mm-hmm. But all of a sudden I learned, I should say, from Cecilia and others that when we see a woman, we just afford her less status, we afford her less competence, like we assess her to have less competence, all the things that I talk about ad nauseum now, but like I didn't know that there was data to show how this plays out. Like in a negotiation, for example, if we're negotiating with someone who we think is a man, we will tend to offer that person more. Like if we're going to split up a set of resources, we will tend to offer that man more than when we think it's a woman, even if it's just a computer algorithm and we don't actually know anything and maybe it's not even a person. But when we think it's a man, we will offer that person more. Things like that I just wasn't aware of because I wasn't in that space of looking at that research and understanding those dynamics. And it really helped me understand why I and my other women colleagues were treated so differently from the men in the hospital. By everyone, by the faculty, by other residents, by nursing staff, by everyone. And so anyway, that's how I ended up.
Okay. So you pursued your PhD around the time of your MD, like together, MD, PhD
good question.
program?
No, this was in my surgery residency because we had to do those 2 years.
You mentioned that. Okay.
Yeah, that was the time that I I just had decided I was going to do this PhD again, thinking I was going to do curriculum design and assessment, but ended up focusing on stereotype threat. Actually, my dissertation was on stereotype threat and how it may affect women who are training to become surgeons.
Okay. So you mentioned you had a grant to study sexual harassment. Well, first, you mentioned that your grant was terminated. So actually, for those that may not know what a R01 grant is, maybe start there. What is that? And when were you granted that? And then maybe tell us about your research.
Yeah. So R01 is a category of grant. The NIH, National Institutes of Health, gives out grants that are all different kinds of categories: K-24s, K-12s, R21s, R23s, R01s. There are more than that. I'm just listing some of them. But the R01 is kind of like the, I don't know, top of the line is the way a lot of people think about it. For an individual researcher, it's usually a significant chunk of money to carry out one specific project. And the process of getting one is quite onerous. Often people will spend months or even longer generating preliminary data on the subject they're trying to study, and then writing these, quite lengthy proposals that have to meet these very specific standards in terms of the formatting and so on. And then it takes a year, basically, for that proposal to get reviewed until the NIH decides who is going to get funded. And they do that by having scientists who review the applications, and then they meet together at what they call study sections, and then they discuss the proposals and they make recommendations. That goes to another layer, which is the advisory council, that decides, who's going to actually get funded. And I'm sharing all that because I think there's an impression out there that like it's all willy-nilly or something, but there's a quite rigorous process for determining who gets funded. And so when we have people in our federal government saying that the studies that are being funded are wasteful, I think that reflects their lack of understanding of both science generally, but also what the process actually has been at the NIH, because it's anything but frivolous.
Right.
Anyway, so that's how the grant gets funded. Our grant was funded in, I think it was fall of 2022, because we were finishing our third year when we got the termination notice. And the proposal itself was for an intervention to try to address sexual harassment in biomedical research. So what we propose and what we've done is we created an educational program for biomedical research faculty across the country that focuses not just on sexual harassment, but also on civility, implicit bias, microaggressions, how to be an upstander. And that's based on recommendations from organizations like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, but also the best evidence we could find from other similar types of interventions as to like what is most likely to make an effective intervention. So things like having it distributed over time rather than one hour or 2 hour block. It seems to be better to have it distributed. Having some sort of interactive element seems to be useful. Having a social element also is useful. That one we were not able to incorporate for a lot of reasons. But anyway, so we basically did a literature review, found what are the characteristics that are most likely to make for an effective intervention, incorporated as many of those as we could, and then created this program. You might think of it like these so-called sexual harassment trainings that most businesses require employees to take, except for I'm just going to say it myself and pat myself on the back. I think it's better. That was the whole point, was to make it better. So that it's in this case, what we did was we made it specific to biomedical researchers, right? It's not a generic module with people in cubicles, when that's not how most of these people's work is actually done. We had specific examples of scientists who had experienced sexual harassment talking about their experiences. So it was very custom made for this group. And again, we incorporated all the best practices that we could, and we created video games where people could actually test out like different things they might say in a challenging situation and see how it plays out. But obviously in the super low stakes environment of our video game that nobody's, tracking or doing, not getting reported anyway, like you can just play around and see what happens if I say this and what happens if I say that. And from our feedback, it seems those video games really were helpful for folks. But Anyway, so that's the basic idea, was to create this intervention and then to test it in a randomized controlled trial with researchers across the country.
Okay, thank you for explaining that. And yeah, congratulations on getting the grant. And I really appreciated you explaining the process, because I think a lot of people definitely on social media do not understand what research is and how to, what getting a grant entails. So what happened? Is it recently that you lost your grant? And I'm assuming because of the changes with this administration. Okay.
Yes, exactly right. So, the current federal government and the leadership decided that they, as I was alluding to earlier, that they think a lot of the work that was being funded by the NIH didn't deserve to be funded, basically overlaying their ideology on top of the science that's being done in this country. And so they've terminated thousands of grants across different topics, by the way. I mean, people often will say they will say that they're eliminating DEI grants. That's already bad enough, by the way. I don't think we should concede that, like, oh, it's okay if you want to eliminate DEI grants, because I completely disagree with that. And it's those grants plus work on COVID, work using mRNA vaccines, work on misinformation and disinformation, work on climate change, any research that involved collaborations with China. It's a lot of HIV studies. I mean, it's much broader than just DEI. And again, I don't accept the framing that those DEI grants are a reasonable loss. But anyway, so my grant was one of those several thousand that have been terminated. And basically it was right at the end of our third year of a 5-year grant. So it was a little over $2 million, the grant in total for 5 years. And we lost the last 2 years, which is a significant amount of money. And also we had, and I do want to clarify this point, by the way, none of that money goes to me, not a single cent goes to me. Some of it offsets my salary that the university would be paying me, but it's not like I get extra cash for getting an NIH grant, because I also think there's a perception that the government is lining the pockets of these greedy researchers or something.
Right.
But that's not how it works. Some of the money goes to the institution to support things like institutional review boards, which make sure the research is conducted ethically. It goes to maintaining animal facilities, for example, not relevant for my specific work, but for a lot of research that's relevant. Anyway, so it's helping support the research infrastructure at these universities. And then, of course, the direct costs of carrying out the study. For us, of course, we have a learning management system. We have a videographer. We have, all the things to create our program, and then participant incentives and so on. So that's what the money goes to. And anyway, yeah, so we had our grant terminated in year 3, which means that it's basically very difficult for us to continue to be able to complete the work as originally intended, that the work the NIH thought was valuable and had given us the money, or had intended to give us the money to do. And so now we're just doing the best we can.
Okay. I was going to ask if you're still able to continue it in some fashion.
Yeah, we are. I mean, my institution did give us a little bit of support, which is helpful. And so we are doing, our original plan had been to run 2 cohorts of faculty, because to have enough participants to have adequate statistical power to be able to make appropriate conclusions, we knew we wouldn't get enough people in 1 year. And so we are moving forward with the second year with the support of these institutional funds, but we won't be able to complete the longer term follow-up that we wanted to have, because of course, with anything like this, it's great if people learn something, but what you're really trying to do is change people's behavior. And that's not something that you can easily assess in a 6-month or a 9-month period. You really need longer term follow-up. And so that's what we probably will not really be able to do for sure.
Well, I wish you good luck with that. And yeah, I think we're going to see the negative impacts of all this over the years to come. I hope we can reverse course. I mean, in the near future, I think just kind of scary right now.
Yeah. And I think that part of the problem, what I want to say about this reversing course thing, is that labs will close. Labs will close. People will leave their academic jobs because they can't get funding, and they will move on to other things. And so when, let's say, 5 years from now or 10 years from now, people recognize what a mistake this has been to cut all this research and decide they want to start it back up, it's going to take generations because people like me will probably not still be here. And so all of us who have tremendous expertise and experience and decades in our fields who can no longer continue to do that work, we have to find something else to do to pay our bills because we live in a capitalist society. And you can't count on, like, no one can count on us just being there. That's one thing. The other is, who is going to go into science in this country?
Right.
It has suddenly become extremely undesirable as a career path. The instability is difficult to manage. The outward negative, vile, the hostility, that's a good word for it. The hostility towards science and scientists. Who would choose to become one of that group? You know, we've already seen graduate students talking about wanting to go to other countries or going to industry instead of continuing on in academics. It's not like you can turn this faucet on and off. It's like the pipes are leaking, and when you go to turn that faucet back on, there's no water in the pipes. So that's kind of the situation that we're in.
Yes. I mean, I feel it as a doctor too. You know, people really just are using us as scapegoats, you know, like for what's wrong in the system, but it's, you know, instead of seeing the bigger forces at play. So, okay. So Argavan, let's get into this topic. So I wanted to talk about this because, you know, after the Me Too movement, I really thought that there would be kind of more of a reckoning, but instead it feels like even more of a backlash and like almost worse. What are your thoughts on that? Like, do you feel like, you know, it seemed like it was getting better after Me Too, but then now, like, I feel like we're, you know, like even just the discourse, you know, out there. So yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think that's somewhat predictable for any social movement, that you make some progress and then you have some regression, and you hope that your progress is consistently greater in magnitude than the regression, so that you're ultimately making forward progress over time. I think the Me Too movement was extraordinarily powerful, and it showed, and I guess, I mean, it still continues. So I'm not talking about it as though it's over, but the peak of it, 2017, 2018, that period showed how many people, majority women, but not all women, how many people are affected by sexual harassment and assault. And it was a recognition that this is not tolerable in our society, that this is not appropriate behavior in our society. But you have people like Andrew Cuomo, who lost his job basically because of sexual harassment, like because he was harassing people in his office. And yet now, fast forward a few years, and he's running for mayor of New York City. I don't think he will win, to be clear, but we now think that's okay, or some segments of the population think that's okay. You know, if you look at the people who were supposedly brought down by Me Too, you know, like Louis C.K., he's fine. He's touring. He's going to do that Riyadh Comedy Festival, which is quite controversial, but, you know, he's going to make a bunch of money, you know, he's fine.
They just go on a religious retreat and then come back out. It seems
I mean,
like
Bill Cosby,
they get baptized.
Right. Bill Cosby was released. Harvey Weinstein, a whole set of charges were overturned. You know, like all these people who were like, oh my, you know, for some folks, it was like a panic. Well, you can't even talk to women anymore because you're going to get Me Too'd and you're going to get canceled. And obviously that's not the case. What these people did was egregious. And even they aren't really being held accountable in the end. I mean, Harvey Weinstein, I think, he's still kind of working through on some set of charges, I think, in LA. So it's not the end of that story, but again, some set of his charges were overturned, and that just goes to
And
show
then
that.
Diddy, I know that's more
Oh,
sexual assault, but Diddy getting only 4 years is also just kind of
oh, it's
a
shameful. Well, not
slap in
only
the
that,
face.
but they did not find him, the jury did not find him guilty on the trafficking charges, which I think is
It's
outrageous.
ridiculous, right?
But that's part of why the sentence is lower. It still could have been higher,
Mhm.
but yeah, that's part of the reason, is because they ignored
Right.
like a
Mhm.
lot of what was going on in that case. Well, I shouldn't say ignored. They decided that they didn't think that's what was happening, but that's
Mhm.
partially because we don't understand, as a society, we don't understand the dynamics of abusive relationships.
Mhm.
And so they were saying things like, oh, well, she was texting him, that she loved him or whatever. What is she supposed to say when she knows he's going to beat her if she doesn't do
Right.
what
Her,
he expects? Right.
right.
There's,
Exactly.
I've
Her
often thought,
entire life was controlled by him.
exactly.
Exactly. Like she's
I mean,
dependent
I've
on
often
him.
thought
Yeah.
jurors in these cases should have some educational training before starting to hear the case,
Mhm.
because I think, we live in a society that's deeply patriarchal
Mhm.
and misogynistic, really, to its core. And unless people have been disabused of the myths that exist in our society, they will bring those into
Yeah.
the trial. And so they will hear, oh, well, it's kind of like the she asked for it. What was she wearing?
Mhm.
Why was
Mhm.
she out at night? I mean, not for the Diddy trial, but I'm just saying in general, like we have
In
this
general,
reaction
they blame
whenever.
blame and shame women, right? I mean,
Exactly.
I often like to point out that like because we're all raised in a patriarchal society, we all have some degree of misogyny that we
Yeah.
have to really fight in ourselves. Even somebody, people like us who call ourselves feminists, we had a certain upbringing, and you have
Yeah.
to like identify when your biases that sometimes you don't realize you might have.
Oh, absolutely. No, we all have it. We all have it because it comes from the society that we live in. And so it's
Hmm.
the constant headlines and photos that we see, where women are always, not always, but often in like very unattractive poses, and the men are looking fantastic, and the man
Right.
is assertive and commanding, and she's a
Hmm.
5-letter word that starts with B, like we're awash in this, so there's no way to
Yes.
really be
Yes.
fully immune to it. We really have to
Hmm.
be aware and be conscientious about counteracting our own biases, and even that isn't probably not sufficient, but it's at least something.
Hmm.
And I think the problem too, when we're talking about sexual harassment and assault, is we are also like awash in rape culture. That's what all those questions
Yes.
are. Like, what did she do to deserve it?
Yes.
So same with Cassie in the Diddy case, like she deserved to some degree, that's the thinking there, that she deserved this treatment because she didn't leave, but she couldn't
Hmm.
leave because of the dynamics of the relationship.
Right.
And
Right.
I think we all saw the video of
The
what happened.
video.
He tried
Hmm.
to leave. He literally kicked her in the head. So to sit there and say she
Hmm.
obviously wanted to be there because she didn't leave is really a naive and simplistic view
Right.
of these complicated dynamics.
Yeah, people are really not understanding because they can't seem to put themselves in her shoes and realize like what it may be like in the company of a very powerful rich man. I mean, that man
Yeah.
could kill her, like,
Yeah.
even if so yeah. So
Yeah. And I want to say on that point though, that not only is it that people have a hard time putting themselves in another person's shoes in that way, but also it's a defense mechanism, because if you really understand the position of someone like Cassie or anyone who's been in an abusive relationship, and if you can put yourself in their shoes, then you can start to imagine that it could happen to you. And nobody wants to believe that. We all, whether, this comes up in the wellness influencer sphere too, but like we all want to believe that we have control. We have control
mhm,
over our health. We have control over our relationships. We have control over how we're
right,
treated by people. But all of that is an illusion. Yes, there are some things we can do to try to optimize our health, but there's nothing I can do to prevent getting cancer. There's nothing. There are things I can do to maybe lower my risk. So I can not smoke. I can not drink alcohol, but I can do all the things. I can be like the perfect specimen of health and still get cancer, right? Because
right.
it's out of our control. People don't like to hear that because it's scary. And it's the same, I think, with these abusive relationships, people, and with cases of sexual assault and rape, people, especially, I think this is true for women, don't want to think that it could happen to them. So then they revert to, well, it was because she was out at this place at night. What was she thinking? I mean, I've seen this with, I don't know if you saw the relatively recent Uber report where they have hundreds of thousands of cases.
You posted it. I read it
of
on
sexual
your feed.
harassment.
Yes. Crazy.
Yes. And people are saying, I mean, some of the cases I should say are that are at high, or the rides that are at higher risk, Uber found in their analyses, that are when people are getting picked up late at night and when they're getting picked up at bars, when they're inebriated, right? And so, of course, some people will say and have said, well, if you're drunk, what are you doing getting in a car with a stranger? But like, it's a company, it's business.
An Uber.
We should not have to be at risk of getting sexually assaulted in a car because we're drunk.
They want us in the ivory towers after sunset.
Exactly.
I guess.
Exactly. And I mean, what is the whole point of Uber? Isn't part of the point of Uber that, like, so you don't drive when you're drunk? I mean, you know what I'm saying? But it's easier cognitively. It is easier to blame that person for making bad choices so that you don't have to think this could also happen to me. Because when you realize it could also happen to you, it's scary.
Right.
It's scary to realize that, like, you could do everything quote unquote right and still have a really terrible thing happen to you, because we do not have control over the world around us. And it is a reality that I think many, many people, including people in our government right now, cannot come to terms with.
Right. And I mean, they make the world unsafe for not just women, all include, so, and perhaps they don't care about women, perhaps they don't care about LGBTQ plus people, but it's also unsafe for men, so that's what's ridiculous about it, is like promoting this culture only makes the world more unsafe for everybody. And so denying reality isn't going to make it any better. So I think in some cases it's just so obvious what sexual harassment is, but I guess I kind of feel like a lot of women are experiencing it and don't even realize, like in the workplace. So I guess how would you define, or what constitutes sexual harassment?
Yeah, there's different categories of sexual harassment, but the most common is, you're exactly right, the things that are happening every day that are called gender-based harassment. So that's things like making comments such as women aren't good at science, women aren't good at math, women have a hard time being doctors, women are bad doctors, like those kinds of things. Sabotaging women's equipment, like if you're talking about either technical tasks like surgery or people in a lab, sabotaging their lab equipment. Obviously, repeated comments about someone's appearance, asking someone out for a date repeatedly, like those are all sexual harassment. As is the things that people, I think, more commonly think about, which are
the obvious.
Like being touched inappropriately, right? That's sexual harassment. The most egregious form of sexual harassment is called a quid pro quo. So it's this idea that, I will, if you do this sexual favor for me, I will give you XYZ opportunity. I will give you a promotion. I will put you on this committee, whatever the desirable thing is in that context. Those are the ones. So we're like going back to our entertainment, you sleep with me, I'll give you a role in this film. And people will tend to think about kind of these more extreme examples, which are obvious. I mean, obviously wrong to, I think, everyone who exists, really, except for maybe a handful of the very worst people who think somehow that's okay. But, for most of us, I think we understand that this leveraging of sexual favors for professional opportunities is wrong. We understand that touching people who do not want to be touched, especially at work, is wrong. Where people have a harder time understanding where the lines are around these comments that are made in our workplaces. Even things
I think having. I was just going to say, I think that's partly why like things like this are underreported, and maybe things get out of control. When you hear a story, you're like, how did this happen in this workplace? Where was the boss? Where was HR? And it probably starts with something small like this. And, instead of recognizing it and nipping it in the bud, it's allowed to progress to something worse.
I mean, I think that's exactly right. People will push boundaries. And if they can say really inappropriate things and nothing happens to them, then they can start doing really inappropriate things. And the problem is not just for the individual who is being targeted, because it affects the whole, again, I do research on my work is on biomedical research. So like if you're talking about a lab that people work in and there's a person who's targeted another person in the lab, it's not just that person who's targeted who is harmed. It's everyone in the lab who's seeing it, who's observing it, who sees that nothing's being done about it, who's concerned for the person who's targeted, who doesn't know what they should do to stop it or what their role should be. Especially if the person who's the perpetrator is, say higher up in the hierarchy, which is usually the case, because sexual harassment, we should be very clear that sexual harassment is not about sex. It's about power, and it's about putting people in their place. And, some of the National Academies folks, I'm blanking on this woman's name at this moment, but she often will say sexual harassment is not a come on, it's a put down. And I think that's right. And I think people lose track of that. People think that's why people say, well, what was she wearing? Because they think it's about sex, but it's not about sex. Right. It's about putting people in their place and saying, don't you get too big for your britches.
And, it's so interesting to talk about like this in terms of you're talking about in, medical research and, obviously we're both doctors, so we see it in healthcare. And I think a lot of people would think like, oh, these are such smart, people and professionals in these industries. Like, why do you think it's, we're not more evolved? Why is it present in these places too, like in healthcare?
Well, I think it's more present. I personally think it's more present in medicine than it is in most other spheres of our society, in part because of the nature of the work, right? It's very high intensity. We've got sometimes patients' lives, if you're talking about an emergency department or 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 an ICU, like, we've got patients' lives in our hands and things are really urgent. And so people will overlook some inappropriate things people might say or do because they're kind of prioritizing the patients, which I think is appropriate to prioritize the patients. And when we accept inappropriate comments and inappropriate behavior, we are actually impacting that patient care because we're restricting who feels comfortable to speak up, what they feel comfortable to say, and when they'll feel like it's safe for them to alert to a problem. And so the right thing to do to prioritize patients is to actually hold people accountable for these types of behaviors. But I think a lot of times our tendency is to overlook because we're so focused on the patient.
We're prioritizing something that we consider more important, right? Yeah. And I mean, we have these power dynamics in medicine for sure, because it is hierarchical, like we start as peons and as med students, and then residency, and you kind of work your way up. So I guess I often like analogize it to like the military.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the National Academies report that came out in 2017, 2018, it might be 2018, sorry. But the National Academies report, that was a landmark report on sexual harassment in science, engineering, and medicine, identified several key factors that predispose an environment to having sexual harassment. So one is it's male dominated. Another is that it's hierarchical. Another is that people may be isolated. And another is that there's tolerance of sexual harassment. And I think really we have pretty much all of that in medicine. To the isolation point, you might be on call with an attending, or you might be in an OR with an attending. You don't have your people, your co-residents, for example, in the room, or you're having a one-on-one meeting with you're a faculty member, you're meeting with your division chief one-on-one, right? Or your department chair. So really we kind of check the box on all of these kind of key criteria that allow for sexual harassment to exist. And the tolerance piece is what you were just talking about, that we overlook it for lots of reasons. And I'm not judging that necessarily. I mean, it would be great if we held people more accountable. But again, it's because we're focused understandably on the patients. And so we kind of in the moment might notice something, but then who has time to go back later, right? We're very busy and we're, again, focused on the patients, and coming back and dealing with, the comment made by Dr. XYZ seems lower on our priorities.
So can you speak to like the personal and professional impacts on the people affected or even the workplace and why like this should be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of data on this that people who experience sexual harassment, and that includes people who witness sexual harassment, have lower levels of engagement with an organization. They are more likely to leave an organization. They have less productivity. They often will change not only the place of work, but the field of work to avoid interacting, especially when you're talking about academics. People will change their dissertation focus. They will change, their entire line of work to avoid interacting with a specific person who has harmed them, because our academic circles in particular are quite small. So it's very hard to continue to do a specific line of research that someone who has harmed you is in without running into them at conferences for like the rest of your life. And some people will be fine with that, and some people really will not, and understandably will choose to take a different path. So we lose scientists because they have experienced this kind of harm and want to protect themselves from it. And so they choose a different path. So it's really costly, not just at the individual level, but also at the organizational level and also at the level of the profession, right? Whether you're talking about medicine or you're talking about science, when people change their specialty because they don't want to interact with Dr. XYZ anymore in like whatever specialty, that's a loss to that specialty, that person is no longer going to be in that field. And for organizations, not only is the problem the lack of or the decreased productivity and the decreased engagement, but obviously there's exposure to lawsuits, right? And those are really costly. And most people, like you said, most people don't report, most people don't bring a case, but when they do, it's costly, not just in terms of, legal fees and like the money of it and having to have a settlement or whatever, but the reputational damage is also really significant. I mean, in particular, we've seen this with organizations that have supported physicians who were assaulting patients, right? If you look at Columbia and how long they kept Robert Haddon on their payroll, even after multiple patients had complained, even after one had called the police after she left his office. And Columbia is still really dealing with the consequences of their decision making around that. And they're not the only ones, right? USC and George Tyndall. I mean, we could spend a lot of time talking about all the organizations that have had, it's usually male physicians, usually assaulting female patients, and then letting it go on for undue periods of time with little or no consequences. Like we could spend a lot of time talking about that. And it's important to note that the people who are most likely to experience sexual harassment, yes, are women, and are mostly or greater risk women with other marginalized identities like racial and ethnic minorities or people with disabilities or other marginalized aspects of identity, and those who are LGBTQ plus, regardless of sex or gender. So, gender and sexual minorities, we say. So it's not just women, to be clear. It's really lots of different people. And not only is it obviously morally wrong to support people who harm others in these ways, but again, it's very costly. So, I say that because a lot of people don't really care about doing the right thing. A lot of people in kind of leadership and decision making roles, that's not their priority. Their priority is protecting the organization. And we live again in a capitalist society, so it's making money for the organization. So that's why I put it in those terms, not because that's what necessarily matters to me, but that's tends to be what matters to the people in charge of these organizations. And that's quite frankly the only reason that anything has been done related to sexual harassment in the first place at our workplaces. The reason that we have these like kind of required or mandatory modules is that it's a compliance feature for these organizations, so that when someone does carry out sexual harassment at that workplace, the organization can say, well, we mandate this module or modules, even though they have no evidence that they're effective, but we have people do these modules, so we are no longer liable for this person's behavior. That's the whole kind of approach that organizations take. Most organizations.
Yes, I would have to say, yeah, hell yes to that. Like I've definitely seen that over, while working in medicine. Like you have to make the problem about how it's affecting their bottom line. Unfortunately, like you said, because we live in a capitalistic society. So thanks for pointing that out. That That was very helpful. I want to ask you, like, what do you think about the workplace? Like, what are some of the gaps or flaws in workplace policies that, like, kind of cause this kind of culture or environment to develop, or what are some of the factors?
Yeah, I mean, some people and some scholars, believe that when you have a workplace that tolerates incivility, that's setting up a foundation for egregious interpersonal things to happen. The challenge with civility is it's been in the news lately. I don't know if you've seen, but it is subjective. And we as a society think certain behaviors are civil or uncivil. Even I'm not saying this well. There we may judge whether something is civil or not based on who is doing or saying it. And so
Mm,
we may perceive a Black woman, for example, making a statement as being uncivil when a white man saying the same thing would be seen as civil. And so we have to be
mm,
careful when we talk about civility to not weaponize it against marginalized people and
mm.
people from minoritized cultures. And I don't know that we do a good job of that, but that's something to keep in mind. But the basic idea is if we accept civility as a norm, then things that are not civil, regardless of whether they're of sexual nature or anything else, will stand out. And then we are better able to identify those things and to address them before they progress down the path to something even more harmful. So that's kind of the idea that people have. And I would argue that the culture of medicine, broadly speaking, is highly uncivil, and
Mm.
the way physicians communicate with each other and with trainees and with nurses, certainly can be civil, but often is not. And so that's why I think we see such high rates of bullying and harassment, generally speaking, and also sexual harassment in medicine specifically. We've accepted a lot of behavior that's not really tolerated in other workplaces.
So, like, what kind of recommendations would you make, like, to improve an organization's, response to complaints?
Well, there's lots of things. One is, people could use our program, but there's a scholar of sexual harassment and assault named Jennifer Fried, Freyd, and she's done a lot of work on institutional betrayal and institutional courage. And institutional betrayal is really the norm. It's what happens in most of our organizations where people may report an instance of sexual harassment or sexual assault, and the institution will cover it up, for example, rather than actually holding the perpetrator accountable. Or they will not do an investigation, or they'll investigate the person who was targeted rather than the perpetrator. There's all sorts of ways in which our institutions betray us
Mm,
as people who trust them and work there or study there or whatever the case may be. And so her call to folks is to really act with courage
mm,
instead, because we see, like, if you look at the Ohio State case where there was a physician who was assaulting the wrestlers and
mm,
other athletes, but mainly the men wrestlers for years, years and years. And the coaches of that team knew
mm.
and did nothing about it. I mean, it's really grimy. People should watch I think is it called
What is
Surviving
it?
Ohio State? There's a documentary about it that came out not that long
Oh,
ago.
okay.
I mean, all of it's just like the ones about Larry Nasser at Michigan State. I mean, they're all illuminating and disturbing. So trigger warning.
Well, I,
But
I think it's interesting if it's about the victims being men, actually, and sometimes I think maybe men will care more if you
yeah,
bring
I
it to
mean,
light when it
it's
affects
hard.
boys and men,
It's hard though for
sadly.
men to speak about sexual assault because
Mm,
there's so much more shame around
right.
it when it's happening to men. And so I really have so much respect for the men who came onto that documentary and shared their experiences, because as hard as it is for women to speak up about sexual assault, I do think
Mhm.
it's harder for men because of our societal framing of these issues and masculinity, as though
Right.
if you're a man and you get assaulted, you're less
Right.
masculine somehow. There's a lot of shaming around that, and I'm not an expert in that specific niche, but I do think it's important to acknowledge. But anyway, the point was just that in that instance, even when the coach of another athletic team at Ohio State went to the leadership and said, hey, this is a problem, they refused to listen to her. And required students to come forward. Well, it's very hard for students to come forward when they're on scholarship, right? And so they're going to risk losing their education to speak up about this. I mean, the men in this documentary quite clearly lay out what the challenges were. And even still, some of them did speak up, and even still nothing was done.
Weren't supported. Okay.
But so that is the institution, Ohio State, betraying those students, those athletes over and over and over again. And now that all of that is out, did that help them? No. Like these cover-ups are pretty much never successful. The truth always comes out. And then you look worse than you would have if you had just dealt with it in the first place. And that's what, Jennifer has a lot of, people should read what she's written about this, but she has a lot of different aspects to institutional courage. But that's one of them is you're covering up because you don't want the reputational damage. But when it comes out, there will be even more reputational damage because people will see that not only did this terrible thing happen, but that you covered it up. That's worse. Don't you see how that's worse? That's part of the argument that she makes, but also that it's the right thing to do, that there will be benefit to the organization if they actually oust people who are acting inappropriately. There's a book called The No Asshole Rule, which is very good and it's very short. I recommend folks read it, but it's all about how, and this is a thing we do a lot in medicine, although the book is not about medical professionals, but you justify the behavior of a specific individual because they're bringing in a lot of money through sales, or they're a high volume surgeon, or whatever the thing is. And so, they may not be nice to people, but they're so important. They're so important that we just put up with it.
We put up with their bad behavior.
And the argument in the No Asshole Rule is that when we do that, we are actually harming the organization, because that person being allowed to be, even if it's just rude and not harassing, it's just rude to everybody, that impacts the productivity of everyone else in ways that you're not able to measure as an organization. And so you're accepting quite a lot of losses for the thing that you can quantify as a gain, but you're not quantifying all the losses. And in the end, you're better off, even if just financially, you're better off getting rid of that person who you see as a star performer than you are enabling them.
What you're talking about, like the institutional betrayal idea, like that kind of reminds me of this other term we sometimes talk about in medicine, like moral injury. Like if you have to work in this place that betrays you and you have to keep working with things that you don't like ethically, with things happening that you don't maybe ethically agree with, that it like creates this moral injury that eventually leads to all the things you're saying: decreased productivity, often a lot of people leaving medicine, that great doctors retiring early, reducing hours, leaving medicine. So again, I guess just back to the point of how it's so important to fix this, even just for to just create the right atmosphere for a healthy work environment for everyone, to prevent like all this turnover.
Yeah. And I think the challenge with it, or there are lots of challenges, but one challenge is that we have to make sure we're not holding people to different standards, which is what tends to happen. You'll label a woman who didn't like bake brownies for the staff as problematic, not because of that, right? You'll pick something else, but in the meantime, you have someone throwing scalpels in the OR,
right.
And because that person is a man, that's not seen as problematic. So I agree with that premise. And in practice, it's actually hard to do. That's why we have these problems. It's hard to do because people will tend to focus on, women, people of color, people with disabilities, LGBTQ plus folks, and pick on things that are maybe not necessarily as egregious, but they see them as egregious because of who is saying it or doing it. In the meantime, they're letting go far more egregious things from majority groups. I think that's very common. I could talk about it for a long time, but I'll just say I think that happens all the time. We have to be really careful about that.
So what tips do you have for somebody that maybe is in a workplace like this, or is even personally experiencing, harassment? Like, either for the person and also maybe coworkers or other people who want to like stand up.
Yeah, I think it's really hard. I think it's really hard to be a person who's targeted in this way. And if there are coworkers who want to help, I think that's actually hugely important if they can come together as a group and go to whoever the decision maker is, whoever the perpetrator reports to, and express concerns. That's going to be, I think, more effective in the end than if it's just the person who's directly targeted, because of all the things we talked about. That person is more likely to get discredited than to get help when they seek it.
Mm.
So other people's involvement,
supporters.
I think that's why we talk in our course about upstanding and the importance of intervening when we see harm happening. And that can happen in a lot of different ways, which we talk about in our program, but doing something is better than doing nothing. And sometimes the something is just talking to the person who's targeted and offering support and validation. And that's meaningful too. For the person who's targeted, I think what most people do is they do nothing because it's really hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard to do because of the way our systems are set up. It doesn't have to be this way, but we have set it up so that it's very, very hard for a person who's experiencing sexual harassment to do anything about it without having severe and negative consequences for their own job and their career. Mm-hmm. So people make this very difficult decision of, do I just stay quiet about this and try to avoid this person so I can keep my job,
right,
pay my bills? Yeah. Or do I leave? I think that's very common response, is to just leave. Or do I report it and try to fight? And I think very, very few people do that because there is so much backlash to doing so, not only at the place you're currently working, but if you want to go work anywhere else afterward. It's very, very hard. People see you as litigious. People see you as the problem. And certainly you're going to have a hard time getting it.
Too. The cost factor too.
Oh, I mean, yeah.
Like a legal.
Obviously. Yeah.
Route.
Hugely expensive. And then the people you work with are going to try to sabotage you getting another job. I mean, that's why we continue to have this problem in terms of sexual harassment in our society. It's nearly impossible, unless you are a person, say, who has independent wealth or a lot of resources to bear, and you have the time and the money and the patience to go through this process, and the professional repercussions don't maybe matter as much to you because you don't really need the job. Like, that's probably the person who's most likely to actually bring a case. But how many of those people do we have in medicine?
Right.
It's not that many. And the rest of us are just trying to figure out, how do I save myself here? And often it is, to your point, by leaving. And then that person will continue to do whatever they were doing to the next person after you. But it's the fault of our systems that we've made it so hard.
Are there any organizations that you're aware of that can help? Like someone can look to for resources?
I mean, the National Women's Law Center, I think, continues. I have not fact checked this recently. I think they continue to have their legal defense fund that was set up as part of Time's Up. So even though Time's Up dissolved, the legal defense fund, at least initially, continued to exist. They may not have money anymore. I'm not sure. Most lawyers will talk to you one time without a fee, so you can get some initial advice.
Right. You can try to look for a pro bono work.
Yeah, I don't know if you'll get that, but just one conversation that can get you started usually is not billed. But I am having a hard time thinking of an organization that is very helpful.
Yeah. No, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, it's a fair question. I just can't. I mean, there's like RAIN for reporting sexual assault. There's like phone lines, but like in terms of navigating your career and all of that, I'm not sure that there is an organization. I actually was trying to create an organization like this a few years ago when Time's Up dissolved, and we have some resources that would be helpful.
I was actually going to ask you if you have thought about doing organizational trainings, because you'd probably be perfect for that sort of thing.
I mean, that is part of the talks that I give. It's often like the national and international talks that you mentioned. It's often that there's something going on at a place and they ask me to come and talk, but they don't bill it as like a workshop. It's like grand rounds.
Yeah.
But I talk about the issues. But yeah, no, I'm actually very open to that. I've had a couple of companies approach me.
I think you could start your own company.
No, I mean, they've approached me to come do something for them. There is one organization that I was just blanking on the name, but it's Physician Just Equity, that exists for physicians who are experiencing really different kinds of challenges, including harassment. So that's the only one I think that comes to mind.
Okay, thanks so much. All right. Well, we have run out of time. I wanted to just maybe ask you what else, what other projects, what else you have on the horizon, and, to share with the audience. And then if you can also tell the audience where they can find you, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, a lot of my work does center around gender equity and sexual harassment. I also do some work, or have been trying to get some work done. It's been challenging, around medical misogyny and medical gaslighting, how we as physicians and other healthcare workers dismiss the symptoms of people, in particular women and women of color, or women with other marginalized identities. So I have some work around that. A lot of the work I've done has been around fertility and family building and the challenges that professionals face in trying to do that, especially in medicine with our very long training, and how we often tend to delay family building until such a time as our ovaries are not at their optimal functioning, and how we then end up having to use IVF at higher rates than other people, and the immense emotional and financial toll of that. So anyway, I've got a series of research papers out on that topic. I guess those are the major buckets of work that I do. In terms of where people can find me, I am on most places. I'm not really posting on Twitter anymore, since it's not really a safe place. And I don't want to support Nazis, I'll just say. But
Same.
Yeah.
I keep my account so no one grabs my name in case I'm hopeful it goes back to some other better ownership someday. Anyway.
Perhaps. But yeah, I'm on Blue Sky. I'm on Instagram. I'm on TikTok. I am on LinkedIn, but I'm not there as much. So if people message me there, I may be delayed in response.
Look in the show notes. I'll put the links there. So thank you so much, Arghavan, for your time.
Thank you. It was so nice to chat with you.
Bye. Here's my closing thought for today. Sexual harassment is part of the design of the patriarchy. It is a mechanism of asserting male power and dominance through objectification, shaming, and blaming, and the silencing of women. In the Gynarchy, we rebuke these behaviors and hold individuals and organizations accountable for supporting them. Instead, we aim to build a safer, more respectful, and more inclusive world. So down with the patriarchy and up with the Gynarchy. Thank you so much for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of the Gynarchy Podcast? Know someone else who might enjoy this conversation? Make sure to subscribe and share the show with your friends and family. Find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and just about anywhere you find podcasts. On social media, we can be found on Blue Sky, Instagram, and TikTok at The Gynarchy. Thank you so much for listening.